That summer arrived quietly, almost without warning. One moment I was buried in textbooks and sleepless nights, and the next, June's sunlight was pouring through my dormitory window as if congratulating me on surviving another academic year. My final exams were finally behind me, and for the first time in months, I could breathe without counting the hours until the next test. I studied nursing at a medical college in the city. It wasn't a compromise or a forced choice. It was something I had wanted for as long as I could remember. Science fascinated me, especially human biology, but what truly drew me to medicine was the feeling that I could be useful, that I could matter to someone when it counted the most. Books had always been my escape. While my classmates scrolled endlessly through their phones or read digital textbooks, I preferred real paper, worn covers, yellowed pages, the faint smell of ink and dust. There was something comforting about holding a book in my hands, as if it grounded me in a world that felt increasingly rushed and artificial. Stories made me believe that life could be deeper than routines and obligations. My own life, however, was painfully ordinary. Classes, shifts at the training clinic, evening studying or cooking simple meals in the dorm kitchen, phone calls with my grandmother. Repeat. I lived with my grandmother, Helen, until I was 16. After that, I moved to the city to study. She still lived in our old house near a small town called Rosefield, a quiet place surrounded by meadows and forests, where summers smelled of wild herbs and warm earth. My parents had died when I was 7. They had been driving home late one evening when another car lost control and slammed into them. The driver disappeared. The case went cold. My grandmother never spoke much about it, but I knew she carried that grief like a stone in her chest. She raised me alone after that. Strong, practical, endlessly patient. She taught me how to dry herbs, how to listen to people instead of interrupting them, and how to stay calm when things went wrong. Some of the villagers called her old-fashioned, but to me, she was wisdom itself. By the time I was 15, people were already asking me for advice. Teas for headaches, compresses for aching joints, simple remedies that my grandmother swore by. I never claimed to be a miracle worker, but I listened, and sometimes that was enough. After finishing my second year, I finally packed my bags for summer break. 2 whole months. It felt unreal. I was walking back from the administration office that afternoon, lost in thought, when a voice suddenly interrupted me. "You look like someone who just won a personal war." I stopped, startled. A man was walking beside me, matching my pace effortlessly. He had dark hair, kind eyes, and a smile that felt genuine. Not practiced. Not forced. "I'm guessing finals," he continued. "Yes," I said, laughing despite myself. "And I survived." "That explains the smile. You were glowing from across the street." I felt my cheeks warm. "Is smiling illegal now?" "Only if it's contagious," he replied easily. "I think you just infected me." His name was Ethan. He studied economics, lived nearby, and somehow made casual conversation feel natural instead of awkward. We walked together longer than I realized, talking about everything and nothing, childhood dreams, favorite books, the strange comfort of quiet places. When we reached my dorm, I hesitated. "I'm leaving tomorrow," I admitted. "Going back to my grandmother's place for the summer." "Then I'm glad I didn't wait," he said softly. "Would you like to take a walk tonight?" Nothing complicated. Just time. I surprised myself by agreeing. That evening, we walked along the river embankment, lights reflecting in the water like scattered stars. He listened when I spoke. Really listened. Not once did he check his phone. When we said goodbye, he asked if he could drive me to the bus station in the morning. "I'd like to meet your grandmother someday," he added, almost shyly. I didn't know why, but that simple sentence stayed with me long after I fell asleep. That night, for the first time in years, I felt that something was shifting. Quietly. Irreversibly. And I had no idea how deeply that single meeting would entangle my life with secrets, danger, and choices I was never prepared to make. The road to Rosefield always felt longer than it really was. Maybe because with every kilometer, the city loosened its grip on me, and memories slowly took its place. The noise faded, buildings gave way to trees, and the air itself seemed softer, cleaner, as if it carried fewer expectations. Ethan picked me up early in the morning, right on time. He wasn't driving anything flashy, just a modest gray car, slightly dusty, clearly well used. For some reason, that made me relax. He helped me with my suitcase, smiled, and asked if I'd slept well.
No ruse.
No performance. As we drove, I told him about my childhood, about Rosefield, about my grandmother, about the way summers there smelled like chamomile and fresh bread. He listened quietly, occasionally asking questions, never interrupting. When I spoke about my parents, my voice wavered despite myself, but he didn't rush to fill the silence. That, more than anything, made me trust him. "I'm glad you're taking me there," he said after a while. "Some places feel important even before you see them." We turned off the main road onto a narrower one, then onto a dirt path, winding through a forest. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, dancing across the windshield. When the first houses appeared, my chest tightened with something close to relief. Rosefield hadn't changed. The same low fences, the same crooked mailboxes, the same gardens bursting with flowers in every color imaginable. People slowed to look at the unfamiliar car, curiosity written openly on their faces. I waved at a neighbor, then another. "My house is the last one," I said. At the edge of the town. When we stopped, my grandmother was already outside, as if she had sensed my arrival before I even stepped out of the car. Her hair had gone completely gray since I last saw her, but her back was straight, her eyes sharp and warm at the same time. She hugged me tightly, held my face in her hands, then looked past me. "And who is this young man?" she asked calmly. "This is Ethan," I said. "He brought me home." Her gaze lingered on him longer than was comfortable. Not rude, assessing. "I'm Helen," she said finally. "Come inside. You must be hungry." The house welcomed us with familiar creaks and cool shadows. The table was already set. Steam rose from a teapot filled with herbs I recognized instantly. During lunch, my grandmother asked Ethan careful questions. Where he studied, where he lived, what his plans were. He answered honestly, simply.
No boasting. No imbachens.
At some point, she nodded slightly, as if noting something only she could see. After eating, I showed Ethan the river, the fields, the narrow paths I used to run along as a child. We sat on the grass, shoes off, letting the sun warm our skin. For a moment, everything felt unreal in its simplicity. "I could stay here forever," he said quietly. I smiled. Most people say that. Few actually could. When we returned in the evening, my grandmother was waiting. Her expression was serious. "You shouldn't stay long," she said to Ethan, not unkindly. "People talk, and summer feelings have a habit of fading when autumn comes." I felt heat rush to my face. "Grandma." "She's right," Ethan said gently, surprising me. "I don't want to cause trouble." He left that night. I was angry at her, hurt, confused. We argued softly, then fell into silence. Only much later did I realize how carefully she had chosen her words. The days passed slowly after that. Ethan called every evening. We talked about everything, about my plans, his classes, his childhood. Yet there were things he never mentioned. His family, especially. When I asked, he deflected with a joke or changed the subject. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Then my grandmother fell ill. It happened suddenly. One moment we were preparing jars for jam, the next she clutched her chest and collapsed. I remember calling the ambulance with shaking hands, my voice sounding far away, even to myself. At the hospital, doctors spoke quietly, carefully. It wasn't a heart attack. Not yet, but it could become one without surgery. The amount they named felt unreal. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply nodded and thanked them. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, calculating numbers that refused to align. My savings were nothing. A student's salary wouldn't be enough. Time was against us. When I told Ethan, he held me as I cried for the first time since childhood. "We'll find a way," he said. "I promise." The next day, he called with news.
A job.
Well paid. Evening hours. Caregiving work. I didn't ask too many questions. I was too desperate. And that was how I unknowingly stepped into a world far more dangerous than I ever imagined. I arrived at the clinic earlier than required. My stomach knotted with anxiety. The building was old, with long corridors that smelled faintly of disinfectant and something metallic, a smell that always reminded me how fragile the human body truly was. I kept repeating to myself that this was just a job, that I could handle it, that I had trained for this. A woman in her early 50s met me near the nurse's station. She was impeccably dressed, her hair perfectly styled, her expression tired but controlled. She introduced herself as Margaret. Her voice carried authority, the kind that expected obedience without needing to demand it. The patient, she explained, had been bedridden for nearly 2 years. No speech. No reaction. Minimal movement. I was to assist with evening care, monitoring equipment, hygiene procedures, medication, and above all, absolute discretion. I signed the contract without hesitation. The salary made my hands tremble. It was more money than I had ever earned. Enough to save my grandmother. The patient's room was quiet, dimly lit. Machines hummed steadily, like a mechanical heartbeat. On the bed lay an elderly man, thin, pale, his face deeply lined. He looked nothing like the photographs I would later see. His name was Arthur. I introduced myself softly, even though I was told it was pointless. "My name is Claire," I said. "I'll be taking care of you in the evenings." His chest rose and fell steadily. His face remained still. The first days were routine. I followed instructions carefully, spoke to him as I worked, describing simple things, the weather, my classes, my grandmother. Talking felt natural, even comforting, as if the words anchored me to something human in that sterile room. Sometimes I thought I noticed changes. A hand slightly repositioned. A blanket slipping when I was certain I had tucked it carefully. Once, I could have sworn his fingers twitched when I mentioned the river near my grandmother's house. I told myself it was imagination. Then one evening, after returning from the supply room, I found his eyes open. They were watching me. I froze. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then his lips parted slightly. "Don't scream," he whispered hoarsely. I nearly collapsed. He spoke slowly, with great effort, as if every word cost him strength. He told me he had been conscious for months, that he pretended not to be, that it was safer this way. "They think I'm already gone," he said. "That's my only protection." Fear crawled up my spine as he spoke of people who wanted him dead, of documents, of control, of money, of a woman who visited him regularly, smiling coldly, waiting. "She thinks I don't hear her," he said. "But I do." I believed him. I had overheard things myself. Whispered conversations in the hallway. A man with sharp eyes and an impatient voice. A woman who spoke of him as if he were already buried. When footsteps approached, Arthur closed his eyes instantly, his face slack once more. The transformation was terrifying in its precision. That night, I left the clinic shaken to my core. Ethan was waiting outside, as always. He wrapped his coat around my shoulders without a word. I wanted to tell him everything, but something stopped me. Over the next weeks, Arthur and I spoke whenever we were alone. He told me pieces of his life, about climbing mountains, about building something from nothing, about losing his son. He spoke of his grandson with pride and fear intertwined. "He's young," Arthur said once. "Too trusting." That sentence stayed with me. I began to notice things I hadn't before. The way Margaret's visits grew shorter. The way paperwork was rushed. The way Arthur's condition was discussed in past tense. One evening, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Plans to move him out of the clinic. Somewhere private. Somewhere controlled. Arthur knew before I told him. "They won't let me leave alive," he said calmly. "Unless someone watches them." That someone, I realized with growing dread, was me. At home that night, unable to sleep, I searched for information online and found Ethan. Not just my Ethan, but a young man smiling beside Arthur in photographs from charity events. Headlines, interviews,
Wealth.
influence. My hands shook as the truth settled in. The man I loved was part of the very family that wanted his grandfather erased. And he had never told me. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my narrow dorm bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation I had ever had with Ethan. Every laugh, every silence, every moment he had chosen not to tell me who he really was. By morning, my eyes burned, my head throbbed, but my thoughts were painfully clear. He hadn't lied outright. He had simply omitted the truth. And somehow, that hurt even more. At lectures, I copied notes mechanically, barely registering the professor's voice. My phone stayed silent. No calls. No messages. I told myself he was busy. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. But fear gnawed at me relentlessly. By mid-afternoon, I was at the clinic again. Arthur was awake when I entered, his eyes sharp despite the weakness in his body. He seemed to sense my agitation immediately. "You know now," he said quietly. I nodded. "You searched," he continued. "I hoped you wouldn't. But I knew you would." I wanted to ask why Ethan hadn't told me. I wanted to ask if everything between us had been calculated. Instead, I asked the only question that mattered. "Are they going to hurt him?" Arthur was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "But if they see him as an obstacle, they might." That was enough. That evening, I waited for Ethan outside the clinic as usual. When he appeared, smiling, holding 2 cups of coffee, something inside me cracked.
"We need to talk," I said.
His smile faded instantly. We walked in silence to a nearby park, sat on a cold bench under yellowing trees. I took a breath that felt like it might shatter my lungs. "I know who you are," I said. "I know who your grandfather is." His face went pale. "I wanted to tell you," he said quickly. "I swear. I just didn't want you to see me differently. You let me fall in love with a lie," I whispered. "It wasn't a lie," he said hoarsely. "It was fear." Tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to continue. "Your grandfather is awake. He's pretending. And he's terrified." Ethan froze. "That's impossible," he said. "They told me. They lied." I told him everything. About the whispers. About the plan to move Arthur. About the man who visited with Margaret. About the danger. Ethan's hands shook as he covered his face. "My mother," he said. God. I didn't want to believe it. For the first time, I saw the boy beneath the confidence.
Lost. Betrayed.
Furious. "We have to protect him," I said. "Before it's too late." The next days blurred together. Arthur was transferred to a private house under the excuse of better care. I insisted on staying as his full-time nurse. Margaret agreed too easily, offering more money than before. That alone terrified me. The house was large, silent, filled with expensive furniture that felt cold and unlived in. Arthur's room was on the 2nd floor, with cameras positioned carefully in corners, watching him, not protecting him. At night, I barely slept, listening for footsteps. Ethan visited whenever he could, avoiding his mother, pretending ignorance. Arthur guided us quietly, instructing Ethan where to find documents, whom to contact discreetly. "He must grow up faster than I did," Arthur said once, voice heavy. "That's my fault." One evening, Margaret arrived with the man I now knew as Victor. They spoke openly in front of Arthur, assuming his mind was elsewhere. "I'm tired of waiting," Victor snapped. "Accidents happen." I stood behind Arthur's wheelchair, my hands clenched so tightly they hurt. That night, Arthur gave Ethan a flash drive hidden inside an old book. "If anything happens to me," he said, "this will protect you." 2 days later, Arthur collapsed. Doctors said it was sudden deterioration. I knew better. As they wheeled him into surgery, his eyes found mine. "Don't let them win," he mouthed. And I realized then that loving Ethan meant standing between him and a danger I could no longer escape. The hours outside the operating room stretched into something shapeless and cruel. Time no longer moved forward. It circled, repeating the same thoughts until they lost meaning. I sat on a hard plastic chair, my hands folded in my lap, staring at a spot on the floor that had been worn smooth by years of anxious footsteps. Ethan paced. He tried to be quiet, but the tension inside him demanded movement. Every few minutes, he stopped in front of me, opened his mouth as if to say something, then turned away again. I knew he was blaming himself. I was too tired to stop him. When the surgeon finally came out, his face unreadable, I stood up so quickly my vision darkened. Arthur survived. That was the word the doctor used. Not recovered. Not stable.
Survived.
He was unconscious again, weaker than before, but alive.
For now.
They moved him to intensive care, limiting visitors. Margaret arrived an hour later, dressed in black, her expression carefully composed. She hugged Ethan, whispered something about strength and patience, then glanced at me with something close to irritation. I understood then that she saw me not as a person, but as a variable she hadn't accounted for. That night, I stayed awake by Arthur's bedside. Machines beeped softly, marking the rhythm of a life that refused to end quietly. I spoke to him in a low voice, telling him about the river in Rosefield, about my grandmother's surgery scheduled for the following week, about Ethan as a child, the way he laughed when he was truly relaxed. "I won't let them take you," I whispered. "Not while I'm here." I didn't know if he could hear me, but I needed to say it. The next morning, I found the first warning. Arthur's medication had been changed. The dosage wasn't lethal. Not yet. But it was wrong. I confronted the nurse on duty, careful not to raise suspicion. She insisted it was a doctor's order. The signature was real. The intent was not. That was when fear stopped being something I felt and became something I acted on. I called in favors. Old professors. A resident doctor I had once helped study for exams. I asked questions that sounded innocent and listened carefully to answers that weren't. Quietly, I began documenting everything: times, names, dosages, conversations. Ethan wanted to go to the police. Arthur had warned us not to.
They won't help, he had said.
Not yet. Not without proof. Margaret visited less often after the surgery. Victor didn't come at all. That worried me more than their presence ever had. One evening, as I was adjusting Arthur's fore, his fingers tightened weakly around mine. I froze. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused but aware. "They're rushing," he murmured. "That means they're afraid." "Rest," I whispered. "Save your strength." He shook his head slightly. "You need to choose soon." "Choose what?" "How far you're willing to go." I didn't answer. I already knew. The same night, I received a message from my grandmother's doctor. Her surgery had been moved up. There were complications. The weight of it all pressed down on me so hard I had to lean against the wall to stay standing. 2 lives. 2 battles. One of me. I left the hospital long after midnight. Ethan was waiting in his car, his face drawn, his eyes red from lack of sleep. "I'll take you home," he said. We drove in silence until I broke. "I'm scared," I admitted. "Not of them. Of failing." He reached for my hand, gripping it tightly. "You're the bravest person I know," he said. "And I should have trusted you sooner." The next day, Margaret summoned me to her office. She closed the door carefully, then smiled. "You're doing an excellent job," she said. "Arthur seems comfortable with you." My pulse quickened. "I want you to stay exclusively with him," she continued. "Day and night. I'll pay whatever you want." It sounded like an offer. It felt like a cage. "I'll need time to think," I said. Her smile thinned. "Of course. But don't take too long." That evening, Arthur spoke more clearly than he had since the surgery. "She's trying to isolate me," he said. "And you. I know. You don't have to do this."
"Yes, Ido," he replied.
"Because if I walk away now, I'll never forgive myself." He studied my face for a long moment. "Then it's time," he said. "The documents." The real ones. He told me where to find them. And as I left his room that night, I understood fully that whatever happened next would change my life forever. There would be no going back. I didn't tell Ethan about the documents right away. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't trust the world around us. Too many walls had ears. Too many smiles hid intentions I couldn't afford to underestimate. Arthur had been clear. One mistake, one wrong person knowing too soon, and everything would collapse. The documents were hidden in a place no one would think to look, inside a false panel behind an old bookcase in Arthur's study. The house was quiet when I went there that night, too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own footsteps, your own fear. I worked slowly, carefully, my hands trembling despite my efforts to stay calm. When the panel finally shifted and revealed a narrow compartment, my heart hammered so hard I was sure someone would hear it. Inside were folders, flash drives, handwritten notes, evidence of transactions, forged signatures, altered wills.
Proof.
I understood then why Arthur had survived this long by pretending to be powerless. These papers were worth more than his life to the wrong people. I hid everything in my bag and returned to his room just before dawn. Arthur was awake. "You found them," he said quietly. "Yes."
Good.
Then listen carefully. He told me what to do next.
Who to trust.
Who not to. Where to take the evidence if something happened to him. His voice was steady, but I could see the strain in his eyes. He knew time was running out. That morning, Margaret arrived unexpectedly early. She stood in the doorway, watching me adjust Arthur's pillows, her gaze sharp and assessing. Victor was with her. He leaned against the wall like he owned the place. "You look tired," Margaret said. "You should rest more."
Alla fine, he replied evenly.
Victor smiled. "Dedication like yours deserves appreciation." I felt sick. That afternoon, my grandmother's surgery began. I wasn't there. That knowledge tore at me more painfully than anything else. I checked my phone every few minutes, my hands slick with sweat, my mind splitting between 2 rooms, 2 hospital beds, 2 lives depending on outcomes I couldn't control. The message came in the evening. The surgery was successful. I slid down the wall outside Arthur's room and cried silently, my forehead pressed against my knees. Relief hit me so suddenly it felt like physical pain. For the first time in weeks, something had gone right, but relief is fragile. That night, Arthur's condition worsened. His blood pressure dropped unexpectedly. Alarms sounded.
Doctors rushed in.
Margaret appeared moments later, her face pale, her concern almost convincing. As they worked on him, Victor caught my eye and smiled. I understood then. This wasn't an accident. This was escalation. They stabilized Arthur, barely. He was alive, again, but unconscious, his body weaker than ever. The doctor pulled me aside and spoke carefully, as doctors do when they're afraid of being overheard. "This keeps happening," he said. "And it shouldn't." I nodded. "I know." That was the moment I decided to stop reacting and start acting. I called Ethan and told him everything. All of it. The documents. The medication changes. The look in Victor's eyes. The fear Arthur had lived with for months. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Ethan said quietly, "They're not getting away with this." That night, we made a plan. We wouldn't confront Margaret. Not yet. We wouldn't go to the police blindly. We would secure Arthur first, legally, physically, irreversibly. Emergency guardianship. Independent doctors. Witnesses. The documents would be copied and stored in 3 different places. If they tried anything again, it wouldn't be quiet. The next day, Margaret cornered me in the hallway. "You've been spending a lot of time with my father-in-law," she said. "I hope you're not getting emotionally involved. That never ends well." "I'm doing my job," I replied. She leaned closer. "Remember who pays you." I met her gaze, without flinching. "Remember who he trusts." Her eyes darkened. That evening, Arthur woke briefly. "You look different," he murmured. "I stopped being afraid," I said. He smiled faintly.
Good.
Because tonight they'll try again. And they did. A power outage. Brief. Convenient. Just long enough for machines to fail. Except this time, backup systems engaged immediately. Doctors arrived faster than expected. And Victor, caught where he shouldn't have been, had no explanation that made sense. Margaret screamed. Accused. Threatened. Too late. By morning, the house was no longer under her control. Arthur was alive. And the war, finally, was out in the open. Morning came quietly, as if the night before had not nearly torn everything apart. Pale light slipped through the curtains, touching the walls of the room where Arthur lay, alive, breathing, stubbornly refusing to surrender. Machines hummed steadily, no alarms this time, no rushed footsteps. Just life, fragile and persistent. I sat beside him, exhausted beyond words. My body felt heavy, my thoughts slow, but inside there was a strange calm. The kind that comes only after fear has burned through you completely and left nothing but truth behind. Ethan arrived just after sunrise. He looked older somehow, as if the night had finally forced him to step fully into adulthood. He didn't say anything at first, just took my hand and held it, grounding both of us in that simple human contact. They're gone, he said quietly. Margaret and Victor. Lawyers, police, doctors, everyone's involved now. They won't be coming back. I closed my eyes. Arthur stirred slightly, his fingers moving weakly against the sheet. I leaned closer. It's over, I whispered. You're safe. His eyes opened slowly. This time there was no need to pretend. You stayed, he said, voice rough but clear. You chose. Yes. He studied my face for a long moment, then turned his gaze to Ethan. You too, he said. I was wrong to think you weren't ready. Ethan swallowed hard. I'm sorry it took me so long. Arthur smiled faintly. It usually does. The following days were filled with procedures, statements, signatures. Independent doctors confirmed what we already knew. Arthur had been conscious, improving, sabotaged. Emergency guardianship was granted to Ethan. The documents spoke louder than any accusation ever could. Margaret never looked at me again. Victor didn't either. Their absence felt like a wound finally allowed to close. My grandmother recovered slowly, but steadily. When I visited her after everything settled, she held my hands tightly and looked at me with eyes that seemed to see far more than I had ever told her. You've grown, she said simply. I had to. She nodded. Sometimes love pushes us into becoming who we were meant to be. Classes resumed. Work continued, though under very different conditions. Arthur began real rehabilitation, slow and painful, but real. I helped when I could, but no longer alone, no longer hidden. Nurses came and went. Doctors explained. Progress was measured in centimeters and seconds, a finger lifted, a leg responding, a voice growing stronger. One evening, as autumn painted the trees gold outside the window, Arthur asked me something unexpected. What will you do now? He said. I thought about it. I'll finish my studies, I answered. I'll become a doctor. Maybe come back to a place like Rosefield. Or maybe stay where I'm needed. I don't know yet. He nodded approvingly. Good. Leave room for life to surprise you. Later that night, Ethan and I walked through the city, hands intertwined. No secrets between us now. No illusions either. I should have told you from the start, he said quietly. Yes, I agreed. You should have. He stopped walking, turned to face me. Can you forgive me? I looked at him, really looked. At the man he was becoming, not the boy he had been when we met. I already have, I said. But trust isn't something that heals overnight. I know, he replied. I'm not going anywhere. Neither was I. Weeks passed, then months. Arthur stood for the first time on a cold November morning. Just a few seconds. Enough to make everyone in the room cry. My grandmother returned home before winter fully set in. Rosefield waited for her, unchanged and patient. When I visited on weekends, I walked the same paths I had as a child, but my steps felt different now. Heavier, surer. Sometimes I thought back to that first summer day, to the girl who believed miracles were something that simply happened to you. I knew better now. Miracles are choices. They're staying when it's easier to run. Speaking when silence is safer. Loving when love demands courage instead of comfort. I didn't know what the future held, for me, for Ethan, for Arthur. But for the first time in my life, uncertainty didn't scare me. Because whatever came next, I knew who I was.